Welcome to the Dip Dive. Today we're taking a shortcut into, well, a really fascinating area of AI research. It's a new kind of large language model architecture called Dragon Hatchling, or BDH for short. Now, unlike a lot of LLMs that are purely focused on mathematical performance, BDH is trying something different. It's attempting to build intelligence using a blueprint, drawn more directly from the biological brain. So our mission today is to unpack what the sources tell us about this, quite radical design. We want to look at its performance compared to models we know, and importantly, whether it delivers on that promise of AI interpretability.
Yeah, and the motivation for this shift, it's interesting. It tackles a problem that's been around since the dawn of computing, really. Thinkers like von Neumann, Alan Turing, they were already grappling with this relationship between computers and the brain. They saw that the brain's structure might hold keys to solving problems that traditional computing struggles with.
And for today's AI, what's the specific struggle?
It's about generalization, especially over time. Our big transformer models, they're powerful, but they can be brittle. They sometimes struggle to, let's say, generalize reasoning robustly over longer periods or integrate complex memories smoothly. Biological systems, on the other hand, use these scale-free networks. They seem inherently better designed for that kind of resilience and flexible reasoning.
Okay, hold on. Scale-free networks. Let's just quickly define that for the listener. What does that biological structure actually give you that, say, a standard transformer lacks?
Well, scale-free networks, they have a specific connection pattern. Most nodes, think neurons, have only a few connections. But crucially, there are a few hubs, nodes with many connections. This makes them really resilient. If you randomly lose a typical node, the network largely carries on. It's an architecture that's very efficient for information flow and maintaining function, which translates well to robust long-term reasoning, something harder to get from the dense uniform systems we usually build.
Right, I see. That makes sense for resilience. So that's the background. Now let's get into BDH itself. The source material calls it a kind of missing link, an LLM based on the scale-free, biologically inspired network. It mentions Naller locally interacting neuron particles.
That phrase, locally interacting neuron particles, is really key. It points to the theoretical underpinning. The goal wasn't just bio-inspiration for its own sake. It was to mathematically link solid theory from areas like computational complexity, distributed computing with interpretability, and critically, to do this without giving up a kind of performance we see in transformers.
How did they bridge that gap, theory and performance?
They formalized it through, well, a chain of reductions. They essentially showed that high-level functions we associate with AI, like attention mechanisms in transformers, can actually emerge from or converge to simple local rules operating right down at the level of individual neurons and synapses. They frame this concept as the equations of reasoning.
Wow, okay. So the complex attention we talk about in transformers might just be the outcome of simple local interactions, like in a brain. That's a pretty big claim. How do they actually model the brain parts? What specific biological features made it into BDH?
They were quite specific. The model had one neurons, yes, but organized into separate excitatory and inhibitory circuits. So some neurons amplify signals, others dampen them, just like in biology. It also uses integrate and fire dynamics. A neuron needs to accumulate enough input signal, cross a threshold, before it fires. That's fundamental to how real neurons communicate.
Standard neural concepts there.
But maybe the most radical departure is how it handles working memory. In BDH, during inference, the memory relies entirely on synaptic plasticity.
Entirely.
Yes, it uses Hebbian learning, the classic neurons that fire together, wire together, principle with spiking neurons to manage its context, not static wheat matrices or separate memory blocks like in standard LLMs.
So instead of a fixed context window, you have these dynamic connections constantly strengthening or weakening to hold information. That sounds fundamentally different.
It is. It changes how the system processes and retains information over time.
But if it's all based on these spiking neurons and local rules, how do you actually run it efficiently? How do you make it work on, the GPUs we use for deep learning?
That's the practical side. They developed BDH Just GPU. It's a version designed to be tensor-friendly. It's still an attention-based state space sequence model, but formulated in a way that works well with GPU hardware using dense matrix math where needed for speed. And this BDH GPU is the version they actually tested empirically.
Right, the testing, the crucial part. You have this elegant, bio-inspired model. Does it actually perform? Or did they sacrifice accuracy for biological plausibility when compared to something like, say, a GPT-2?
Well, the results were actually quite strong. Empirically, BDH GPU performed competitively with GPT-2 architecture transformers on standard benchmarks,
Hmm.
language modeling, translation tasks.
Tentatively, even at similar parameter counts.
Yes, across the tested range, from around 10 million up to a billion parameters using the same training data. Given the very different architectural foundation, achieving that kind of parity is pretty significant.
Okay, that's impressive. What about scaling laws? Transformers are famous for their predictable improvement as you add data and parameters. Does BDH show that same behavior?
It does. BDH GPU exhibits those familiar transformer-like scaling laws, parameters versus loss. The way it's parameterized helps here. The main scalable part is the neuron dimension, which can be large, but the law is a low-rank dimension, kept small. So even with many neurons, the connections remain manageable as the model scales up.
That efficiency sounds useful, and it apparently leads to another quite unique finding mentioned in the sources, model merging.
Yes, composability. This is a really interesting result. It suggests a level of modularity you don't typically see. They found you could create a larger functional model by simply concatenating the parameters from smaller models trained on different data.
How did that work in practice?
For example, they took a model trained on English-French and another trained on English-Portuguese, combined their parameters, and ended up with a multilingual model. No complex retraining needed. The modular structure seems baked in.
Okay, performance is there, scaling is there, modularity is a bonus. But let's get to the core promise, interpretability. If it works like a simplified brain, can we actually look inside and understand it? What did they find about its internal workings?
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. The design inherently pushes towards interpretability. For instance, the activation vectors in BDH are sparse and positive.
Sparse and positive, meaning
Sparse means only a few neurons are active at any given time. Empirically, these fresh activation vectors, which they call andollars, were extremely sparse, maybe only 5% non-zero activations during processing. And positive just means the activation levels aren't negative.
right, unlike a typical LLM where activations are dense, complex vectors, making it hard to pin down meaning, 5% active sounds much more manageable for analysis.
It does. And this sparsity seems linked to another major finding, monosemanticity. They observed this even in smaller models, below 100 million parameters.
Monosemanticity, meaning one thing corresponds to one neuron or synapse.
Essentially, yes. Specific individual synapses appeared to strengthen their connection, specifically when the model encountered or reasoned about a single distinct concept. Think about the concept of country. In a normal LLM, that idea might be distributed fuzzily across many dimensions. In BDH, they found evidence of specific synapses becoming highly active only for that concept.
Did they give concrete examples?
They did. They mentioned finding a specific currency synapse and a country synapse. These particular synapses showed heightened activity related to those concepts, whether the input was in French or English.
So a single connection becomes dedicated to an abstract idea like currency, regardless of the language used. That ties the meaning directly to a physical part of the network.
That's the idea. And this isn't just about individual synapses. The overall structure that emerges during training is also revealing. When they analyzed the network of interactions between the BDH neurons derived from the trained parameters, it wasn't random or uniform. It naturally formed a graph with high modularity.
Meaning clusters or communities of neurons?
Right, functional clusters. And it also showed a heavy tail degree distribution. Remember those highly connected hubs from scale-free networks.
Ah, so it comes full circle. The scale-free structure they were inspired by actually emerged from the training process.
Exactly. It wasn't explicitly forced, it was an emergent property. And this structure, the modularity and the heavy tail distribution, is consistent with creating that efficient, resilient, scale-free network they believe is key for information processing, much like in the brain.
This has been really clarifying. Let me try to summarize the main takeaway for you, the listener. It seems BDH manages to translate core AI functions, like attention and feed-forward processing, into a model structure that is not only biologically plausible, but also, crucially, inherently interpretable. It suggests that high performance doesn't have to mean building inscrutable black boxes.
Well put. And perhaps the most thought-provoking conclusion from the source material stems from this linkage. The findings suggest that something relatively simple, like Hebbian learning, fire together, wire together, when combined with these kinds of neural circuits, might actually be sufficient to perform complex reasoning, including language and thought processes operating at brain scale, potentially even within timescales of minutes.
Efficient, just Hebbian learning in circuits.
That's the provocative suggestion. It potentially reframes what we consider the minimum computational machinery needed for the kind of cognition we see in the brain, or the profound thought to end on.